This is Coventry, in the heart of the Midlands. For most of the 20th century, it was Britain's motor city, home to the car industry's best engineers, designers and brands. I grew up just down the road, and my dad used to work for Coventry tractor maker Massey Ferguson, so I've got a passion for this city and for the cars made here.
Light.
Now this film is a celebration of the golden age of Coventry's motor industry.
I say they've got a winner.
We'll find out how the cars were crafted and pay tribute to the visionary leaders behind Jaguar, Riley and Standard Triumph.
I think he's a forgotten hero in a sense. But who's heard of Captain Black? You know, who's heard of Sir John Black nowadays?
We'll hear what it was like to drive Coventry's cars in the world's most dangerous races.
Of course, the mountains were pretty horrendous. You felt quite dizzy going around the corners. It was a little bit scary when one was near the edge. It just used to go on and on and on, bend after bend after bend.
And we'll meet those determined to preserve the city's motoring heritage.
Opening the Riley archive would be an intensely moving occasion for me, and I would feel I was doing it for my father and his brothers, because Riley history is Coventry history.
Featuring a treasure trove of rare archive film and photographs, this is the untold story of a remarkable city, the ups and downs of its motor industry, and of the classic British cars made in Coventry. The story begins in 1897, when the first British-built production cars began to appear on our roads, and they were made in Coventry. They were built by Daimler, and today only 4 remain. The oldest one, still regularly driven, is owned by Michael Flather.
Well, my father bought it in 1951, and it was a car that was saved by the Veteran Car Club from being crushed and used for ammunition or something during the war effort.
What sort of reaction do you generally get when you're out from people today?
Oh, it's amazing.
Thumbs up.
You've got little children, old ladies, everybody waves at you. And because we're going so slowly, you can do high five on the side of the road to people. But what it does, it brings a smile to people's face. Which in this day and age is wonderful, isn't it?
In 1897, it took 3 months to build a Daimler, but they caught the public imagination when one was driven from John O'Groats to Land's End. Soon, even the Prince of Wales had one, and so began our love affair with the car.
Well, just look at this road here. We're all on our own. There's not another car around. And it could be back 100 years ago, couldn't it? We're just tootling along.
What's not to love about this? If you love cars and you love engines, this is as pure and basic as it gets, isn't it?
As basic as it gets, definitely.
It'd be great if you could put the heating on.
Daimler made cars like Michael's in an old cotton factory known as the Motor Mills on Coventry's Sandy Lane. Today, little remains of what was the birthplace of the British motor industry. So why Coventry? Well, for centuries, this has been a city full of artisans and engineers. Once upon a time, Coventry was a city of skilled weavers and watchmakers. But when those industries collapsed, their craftsmen and women found work in an exciting new transport revolution: bicycles. Bikes were first made in Coventry in 1869, and by 1900 there were 75 different cycle companies in the city. Some, like Humber, Rover and Singer, would go on to make cars. But only one car manufacturer actually began as a family of Coventry weavers. Its name? Riley. Riley was once famous for its beautifully crafted, sporty cars. And today, Victor Riley is the eldest surviving member of Coventry's greatest car manufacturing dynasty. For almost half a century, Riley was a family business, and some of their history is kept in the archives of the British Motor Museum in Warwickshire.
Hello, Victor. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Here we are.
Thank you. The Riley family story, because I am part of the output, fascinates me because of the family involvement and their total commitment to Coventry and the Riley car, because Riley history is Coventry history.
The story of Riley cars began with Victor's grandfather, William Riley. He'd run the family weaving business until the market crash led him to bicycles. The problem was his 5 technically gifted sons had greater ambitions. By 1898, 16-year-old Percy Riley had secretly designed and built this, his first car. But William didn't believe there was a future in motorised transport.
Grandfather said, "I've just spent all my money installing bicycle-making machinery. I can't scrap that. No, I'm sorry, we're staying with bicycles."
But William's sons ignored him, making motorbikes and tricars until finally in 1906 he gave in and the first Riley cars went into production. Victor's father, also called Victor, would soon take charge of the company, while each of the brothers honed their own particular craft skills to make Riley truly a family business.
Alan made the bodies, Percy made the engines, Stanley designed the chassis and bodies, and Tet did a multiplicity of tasks, helping out the company wherever father pushed him.
By 1913, there were 20 manufacturers in the city, employing over 12,000 workers and turning out 9,000 vehicles a year. There were dozens of component manufacturers too, suppliers of everything from engines and car bodies to the nuts and bolts that held them together. But the First World War brought the industry to a halt as the city's factories were turned over to help the war effort, making planes, engines and munitions for Britain's armed forces. Away from the factories, among those who fought overseas, was John Black, a shell-shocked veteran of Gallipoli and Ypres, who would go on to become one of the most influential characters in the history of the British car industry. Captain Black, as he liked to be known, was the man behind Coventry's Standard Triumph, once one of Britain's largest and most successful car manufacturers, whose iconic designs sold around the world. But his son Nick grew up knowing little about him.
My dad was an enigma. He was a figurehead. My memories of him are so scanty as a child, and he was always somebody to be respected, to be revered. But without the photos that I inherited from my mum when she died, I don't think there would have been a story. It was because of the photographs that it triggered something in me that made me want to find out more who this person really was, more than just my dad. But the more I found out about him, the more complex I found him to be.
From a modest background, Captain Black was an ambitious social climber who worked his way into Warwickshire's hunting and shooting set, got a job at Coventry's Hillman Motor Company, and married the boss's daughter, Daisy Hillman. It was the first step in a remarkable career. The demands of the war years enabled some of Coventry's car manufacturers to expand their factories and refine their production methods. They faced stiff competition from Birmingham's Austin, Oxford's Morris and Manchester-based Ford, which had brought the first car assembly line to Britain, churning out over 20 Model Ts an hour. But for some companies, making cars was still a highly skilled, time-consuming business. Among them was Alvis, then as now one of Coventry's most prestigious motor manufacturers. There is something incredibly strokeable about this car, isn't it?
I think so.
It's just you want to you're just drawn to touch it.
Yes, it's very tactile.
It's stunning. So just what is it?
This is an Alvis Speed 25, which is a 3.5 litre straight six engine.
I mean, this one is fantastically original, isn't it?
It is.
Absolutely glorious.
Well, it's been built by hand.
So how many people, how many engineers, how many craftsmen were involved in building one of these cars?
Well, in the 20s, Alvis would have had probably around 500 people producing about 20 cars a week.
Gosh, that's nothing in comparison to what was evolving in terms of the car industry. So like with Ford and the Model T, was it 20 an hour?
But most Alvis customers were connoisseurs. They were buying more than just a motor car. They were buying something which was particularly their choice.
This photographic survey of the Alvis works, carried out in 1929, reveals how their cars began life in static workshops. They were coach-built, which meant while their craftsmen were responsible for building the chassis and engine, a specialist coach builder would handcraft the body to the customer's personal requirements. So in coach building, compared to the mass production, you decide you've got your rolling chassis, but you could have something that looks like this or something that looks like another style to it. So those were your options. So compared to now, where you might choose the upholstery on your seats as the kind of only options you'll get, you could have a completely different looking car on the same rolling chassis.
Yes, you could, and therefore the car was hand-built for you. And I always feel it has the personality of the technicians and the craftsmen who made it. And the customer must have felt an attachment to the car that would be difficult with a mass-produced car of the time.
They have personality.
They do.
They're works of art.
Yes, they are.
They are stunning. Alvis kept quality high and volume low, but in the Depression years of the late 20s and early 30s, few people could afford handcrafted bespoke cars. The way to make them cheaper was to follow Ford's example and mass-produce them on the moving assembly line. It was war veteran Captain John Black who first brought this new technology to Coventry. In 1929, he left Hillman to become joint managing director at the financially struggling Standard. Not long afterwards, this film was released to show off the production process he introduced to its factory in Canley, designed to run with military precision.
Now you see the secret of rapid output and, incidentally, of low prices. The conveyor track, in which every piece of work moves at a carefully calculated rate so that each man's work is completed in a certain time. The parts move along as they are assembled, and other conveyors bring in fresh parts to be assembled in their turn. Well, one for the road. Petrol, with a dash of oil and water, please.
John Black's assembly line worked wonders. Within a decade, output at Standard shot up from 8,000 to 55,000 vehicles a year. And although the work could be repetitive and boring, the captain had a way of maintaining the morale of his troops.
The remarkable thing about the shop floor at Standard was that the boss, my dad, used to take a very personal interest in everybody that worked there. He actually remembered their names. And it wasn't a rare occasion that he'd be walking along discussing something quite serious, and he'd see one of the workers. He'd say, "Look, how's your mum at the moment? How's her arthritis doing? It wasn't just a ploy. He genuinely was interested, and they loved him for it.
Well, sir, the 1934 range of standard cars speaks for itself. There are many special features, including entirely new coachwork, far roomier and more beautiful.
As well as a car that was cheap to buy, customers wanted one that was cheap to run too. With more tax charged on powerful engines, smaller so-called light cars were all the rage. Among the most popular was a car made by William and Reginald Roots, ambitious car dealers from Kent who'd moved into manufacturing when they bought Coventry car makers Hillman and Humber in the late 1920s. The Hillman Minx was launched in 1932 and soon 20,000 of them were sold every year. But not all customers wanted their cars to be practical and economical. Some wanted them to be fast. From the earliest days of the industry, Coventry's manufacturers had made cars built for speed. Winning races was good for publicity and for sales, and technical innovation was often driven by the demands of the track. Still going strong, the Riley family made some of the era's most successful sporting cars, and one of Riley's most successful racing drivers was Victor Riley's mum, Dorothy. This is Dorothy, filmed in 1934, a few months before she married Victor Riley Sr. It was also the year she entered the famous Le Mans 24-hour race in a Riley Ulster Imp with Canadian co-driver Kay Peter. They were among the first women ever to compete at Le Mans, where victory goes to the drivers who complete the most laps. But Dorothy didn't get off to a very good start.
On the day of the race, my father hadn't arrived, and that distracted her, and she was a little bit disappointed. So running across, jumping in the Imp, she shut the door on her fingers. There was blood everywhere in the cockpit, her shoes, her gloves, everything was covered. And at the end of the first hour, she came into the pits, last 43rd. So the pits cleaned her up, gave her new gloves, new shoes. At that point, my father arrived, gave her a sprig of white heather. She jumped in the car, off she went. By nightfall, she was up to 13th, and she stayed 13th for the rest of the race, and that was an enormous success.
Dorothy became the first British woman to complete the race, and none have ever finished higher. And with the rest of the Riley team finishing 2nd, 3rd, 5th and 6th, beating the likes of Bugatti and Aston Martin along the way, 1934 was Riley's most successful year. But the company was about to face some stiff competition from a new kid on the block, Jaguar. For decades, the company has produced some of the most iconic sports cars and luxury saloons in motoring history. Behind it all was Sir William Lyons, an astute businessman with a natural talent for design. Michael Quinn is his grandson.
For me, I'm incredibly proud of what he did. I mean, he came from really pretty much nowhere. He was not trained as an engineer, he was not trained as a draftsman, he wasn't trained as a designer in any way. He went straight out into the outside world and created this sort of global company, creating some of the most beautiful cars that have ever been produced.
The company began life in Blackpool in the 1920s, when motorbike enthusiast William Lyons formed the Swallow Sidecar Company with his neighbour William Walmsley. Before long, they were coach-building car bodies for the Austin 7 chassis, and their first car, the Austin 7 Swallow, was born. Costing just £175, demand soon outstripped supply, but the expertise they needed to expand the business lay elsewhere.
So he took a decision to move not just the factory, but the staff and his family down to Coventry.
Well, I don't really remember very much of the time in Blackpool because I was about 2 when we moved to Coventry. But once he started the business, he realised that he was responsible for bringing up a family, and he was always, I think he had times when he was very worried as to how he was going to do that. So it was always very important that he made a success of it. I used to think he was absolutely wonderful. I used to think he'd make a good Prime Minister.
In Coventry, Swallow went into production in an old munitions factory in Foleshill and changed its name to SS Cars, striking up a friendship and a business deal with Captain John Black at Standard, who agreed to sell them engines and specially designed chassis. In 1934, William Lyons took sole charge of the company, and the following year launched a new model. He called it the SS Jaguar. History was in the making. Meanwhile, at Standard, the launch of a new range had boosted sales and helped fund Captain Black's flamboyant lifestyle of wild parties, skiing trips to Switzerland, and the purchase of Mallory Court, a sprawling country estate where he lived with his wife Daisy and daughter Rosalind. On the surface, everything in the garden looked rosy, but John Black was a troubled man.
Obviously, my dad was unhappily married to Daisy. It was faltering at the seams. And he used to lock himself in the library at Mallory with a pistol, a loaded pistol, and just have shooting practice against the wood panelling. So he had some issues. How he dealt with it, he drank. And he used to drink for 6 months, and then he'd stop drinking for 6 months. And he goes to a dance in Nuneaton and bumps into this wonderful young woman called Joan, and who was my mother, aged 21, 17 years his junior. And they instantly fall in love. My mother said she'd never met anyone like him in her life before. But it was like another 6 years before he actually finally got divorced.
By the end of the decade, Standard and the Roots Group were each making around 10% of Britain's cars, but Oxford-based Morris led the market, making over a quarter. It had already swallowed up some of Coventry's best engine and coach-building companies, when in 1938, Morris's owner, Lord Nuffield, bought one of its best-loved car manufacturers too, Riley, which had been hit hard by failed business deals and inefficiencies.
I'm criticising my father here, but there was an advert, and that was, I know we have a very fertile design department, but we just love designing new cars. But we make far too many, of course, far too many models, but we just love doing it. Now, therein lies a cause of costs not being controlled. And as soon as they joined Nuffield, the range was dropped to 2 models. And of course, Nuffield made a lot of money out of Riley's after the takeover.
It wasn't the end for Riley, as Nuffield kept the name and Victor Senior his job. But 40 years after Percy Riley had made his first car, the company was no longer in family hands. But as the decade drew to a close, there were more urgent concerns. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Coventry's car manufacturers were already prepared to do their bit. Under the so-called shadow factory scheme, new production facilities had been built in readiness for the conflict, so military production began straight away. However, Coventry's strategic importance was well known to Adolf Hitler, and from August 1940, the Luftwaffe began to target the city in deadly air raids. The worst attack came on the night of the 14th of November, when German bombers dropped 500 tons of high explosive and over 36,000 incendiary bombs on the city. When daylight finally came, the Triumph and Rover car factories had been destroyed and others badly damaged. Coventry was in ruins.
Amid the wholesale wreckage of a noble city, crushed by the force of hundreds of tons of bombs, the steeple of her one-time beautiful 14th century cathedral looks down on a scene of indescribable desolation. Words are hopelessly inadequate to describe the horror and indignation felt all over the civilized world at this wanton devastation. 1,000 citizens of Coventry were killed or maimed by the Nazi disciples of slaughter, who kill mostly for the joy of killing and destroy mostly for the joy of destroying.
Despite the devastation, the city and its people refused to give in. And from Coventry's car industry came the planes, engines, motor vehicles and munitions that eventually helped Britain to win the war. By then, Coventry's regeneration was well underway, led by Rootes Group boss Sir William Rootes, who'd just been given another vital role to lead the industry's new export drive. Britain was in debt, particularly to America, so the government had made overseas sales a priority.
News from Coventry, where a famous motorcar factory greets the return of many employees now demobilised from the Navy, the Army and the Air Force.
This newsreel promoting the export drive was filmed at the Standard factory in Canley shortly after the war, where the company's dynamic boss, Sir John Black, was already doing his bit, having relaunched Standard's 8 and 12 horsepower saloons just 10 days after VE Day.
All complete and very nice too, but don't forget that all-important label.
Now divorced, married to partner Joan and knighted for his war work, the man who'd brought the assembly line to Standard was about to transform the company once again by signing a lucrative deal with entrepreneur Harry Ferguson to bring tractor making to Coventry, and in buying what was left of sporty car maker Triumph, his opening salvo in a bitter new battle with an old friend.
After the war, 1945, my dad was looking basically for a new image. He wanted a name to give to a sports car so he could rival William Lyons of Jaguar. And that was his ambition. He knew where he wanted to get to.
So why the new rivalry? Well, the story goes that back then, William Lyons had big plans for Jaguar. He'd already expanded production into the vast Daimler shadow factory here on Browns Lane and changed the company name from SS Cars to avoid Nazi connotations. But what he really wanted was to start making his own engines rather than buying them from John Black. And not only did Black agree, he actually sold Lyons the machines to make them.
My grandfather very quickly went and collected them, had them installed in his own factory. But apparently John Black then actually did change his mind and realised he might have made a mistake.
My dad realised he'd made the biggest mistake of his life because Jaguar were about to become one of the biggest companies in Coventry at the time. So he went back to Lyons and started begging, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, can I buy this back off you?
But unfortunately it was too late and my granddad wasn't going to let it go.
And he said, no way, mate, your word is your oath. And, you know, so he didn't. So from that point on, they become abject rivals.
John Black's instincts were proved right. The new machines led to a new 3.4-litre six-cylinder engine called the XK, which ended up in a brand new sports car, the XK 120. Capable of over 120 miles an hour, it was the world's fastest production car.
And it was just a huge, resounding success. But the most important thing, probably, was a huge order from America.
Well, I certainly remember him going to America just after the war and meeting Clark Gable and all the film stars that had fallen in love with the XK. And it was a very exciting time.
In 1950, Pat began racing in the XK 120 with her then husband, rally driver Ian Appleyard. competing in extreme conditions in some of Europe's most gruelling rallies, like this, the 3,000-kilometre Alpine.
Of course, the mountains were pretty horrendous, and you felt quite dizzy going around the corners. It was a little bit scary when one was near the edge, and it just used to go on and on and on, bend after bend after bend. It was great fun because, of course, there was a very sort of camaraderie spirit amongst all of us, and we always felt we were doing quite a lot of useful work for the factory in discovering faults in the car that led them to make improvements. So we did feel that we'd achieved quite a bit.
In 1953, Pat and Ian were awarded the Gold Cup, having won the Alpine 3 years in succession.
Once again, Earl's Court houses Britain's annual motor show. And if your pocket won't stretch this far, well, accent this year is on the family man's car.
Determined to outdo his new rival, Sir John Black launched his answer to the Jaguar XK120 at the Earl's Court Motor Show in 1952. It was officially known as the Triumph 20 TS.
They showed it at the motor show, and the design was not the best. I mean, some people call it TR1, but it was Ken Richardson we can thank for telling the truth about it. He was test driving it, and he told my dad exactly what was wrong with it. And he said, it's absolute rubbish. He said, it's a death trap. And so my dad said, well, if you could do any better, could you redesign it? And he did.
On this test road in Belgium, Ken Richardson took the redesigned and renamed TR2 up to a top speed of 124.889 miles per hour, breaking the world record for a 2-litre production car. Costing less than £1,000, the TR2 was loved in Britain and America too. Sir John Black's decision to buy himself a sports car company had paid off.
The whole motive behind buying the Triumph Motor Company for £75,000 in 1945 was to get a name so he could rival William Lyons of Jaguar. So I think he probably did feel at the end that he had achieved his desire for the sports car.
Despite the TR2's success, Sir John's core business remained the volume production of family cars. Luckily for him, Britain was about to enter a golden age. During the 1950s, car production in Coventry doubled as affluence increased, particularly amongst Britain's working classes, who were buying more cars than ever before. In 1953, Standard introduced this, the budget price Standard 8. At under £500, it was Britain's cheapest car, and took to the road alongside Standard's already popular American-influenced Vanguard. With American culture shaping everything from music to fashion, it's no surprise that some of Coventry's cars got an American makeover too. So what did the Rootes brothers do to jazz up their good old Hillman Minx?
The pre-war Minx is the kind of classic 1930s looking car, isn't it?
It certainly is, yeah.
The big headlamps either side of its nose, the radiator grille.
Sit up and beg, and yeah.
But its future was going to be pretty dramatic, to say the least.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they'd had a relationship with an American industrial designer called Raymond Loewy. He knew his business, and he got that absolute design flair. And one of the classic things he'd done was the Studebaker.
Wow. Glorious car, isn't it?
It is.
Such a different look to the pre-war cars. Yeah. Integrated headlights in the wings, the body, you know, clearly designed with some flair and style, and then set off with all the chrome and the white wall tyres. Just a very different approach to the motor car.
And what he managed to do was to take those design influences and transform the Hillman Minx.
Loewy's Minx was a revelation, with a 3-seater bench seat in the front, an American-style column gear change, and a generous helping of chrome. It took the market by storm. But although it was styled by an American, it was up to Hillman's draftsman in Coventry to bring the Minx to life. Upstairs, Andy had the evidence.
Oh my God. Are these all drawings?
Yeah, we've got 300,000 engineering drawings here. All of the drawings in the tubes are Roots drawings, and all these cabinets are absolutely full as well.
Wow.
All Coventry car companies had a drawing department where design concepts were translated into scale diagrams from which component parts were made, but many have been lost or destroyed, so the Roots collection is extraordinary.
Oh, look at this. It is just gorgeous. So what was the process for producing an original like this then?
Well, the draftsman would make all the calculations and then draw it in pencil. And once he was satisfied that it was right, he would then pass it over to a team of tracers, which was predominantly women, because they got a far better hand, and they would go over it in ink to make it a final print.
But it's the detail. I mean, look at all the threads that you can see in these holes.
Every bit of detail is on that drawing that somebody would need to make the part.
And the precision of this, done by hand and human eye, to create something that is an engineering drawing, but to me, you step back from it, it is a work of art.
Well, the Coventry draftsmen were an immensely skilled group of people. It's a great record of Coventry's past.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Hillman Minx remained hugely successful and kept its American influence through a number of design updates throughout the 1950s and 60s. Meanwhile, in 1952, Riley's owner Morris had joined forces with Austin to create BMC, the British Motor Corporation, the largest British car manufacturer of the day. Riley's first post-war cars, the much-loved RM series, had combined luxury with sporty performance and were the last to have had input from Victor Riley Sr. before he was sacked by BMC and production moved from Coventry to Abingdon. The family connection to the business was gone forever.
I felt a bit sorry for my dad because it was taking away such an enormous part of his life, right from the age of 14 to 70. And I thought, well, what will he do? What will he do? As a small boy, that sort of, I won't say frightened me, but worried me.
It got worse for Riley when the final car in the RM series, the Pathfinder, was rushed to market by BMC in 1953.
That looked a classic Riley, but that model was launched a year too soon. So the first year's customers did the development work, by which time the nickname was Ditchfinder, not Pathfinder, and the damage was done and the brand was destroyed. I think it's desperately sad because that probably was the most harmful move that BMC made.
Riley's place in the luxury sports saloon market was filled by Jaguar, whose confident slogan, grace, space and pace, helped to make the Mark 1s and 2s bestsellers. However, William Lyons had more to prove on the racetrack at Le Mans, and Jaguar's secret weapon was the D-Type. With its aerodynamic monocoque design and stabilising fin, it had been built to win. Among the team entered for the 1955 race was a Jaguar legend, chief test driver Norman Dewis, a man who loved speed.
It's something I've never understood, why I wanted to go fast. I can't explain it now, but I was always wanted to go quick.
The flag's down and the drivers start their well-known sprint for the cars.
Quicker they go, the better I enjoyed it, you know.
First away is Castellotti in his Ferrari, closely followed by a Jaguar. stream away beneath the Dunlop Bridge, and behind them the field blinds through the dust of the leaders.
Powered by the XK engine, the D-Type was fast, particularly on the circuit's most famous stretch of road, the 3.5-mile long Mulsanne Straight.
I did 192 down Mulsanne in '55, and that was beautiful. The car was stable, fingertip control, beautiful. 192. In 1955, that was quick.
On the 16th lap, the three leaders race together, but the Jaguar speed begins to tell, and Hawthorne takes Castellotti before they sweep round Mulsanne.
By lap 35, Jaguar and Mercedes were locked in a head-to-head battle when disaster struck.
Levesque's Mercedes hurtles onto the parapet. Macklin's Austin Healey smacks headlong into the retaining wall as a tyre spins and subsides, silent and grotesque in this moment of disaster.
Mercedes driver Pierre Levey died when his car hit a wall following a collision. The impact sent engine parts flying into the crowd, killing 83 spectators and injuring 180 more, in the worst accident in motor racing history. Despite the tragedy, the race continued, and in the rain the following day, Jaguar won.
Although we knew quite a few people had been killed, nobody realised to the extent of how many until about 10 o'clock Sunday morning. It was a bit of a hollow victory, really.
Meanwhile, Jaguar's old rival, Sir John Black, had been involved in a car crash near his factory on Banner Lane in Coventry, and while recuperating at home, had received a visit.
And Tom Thorne, the butler, said one evening, "Sir John, the board of directors of the Standard Motor Company are here to see you." So he said, "Send them in." And they walked in with this letter of resignation, slapped it down on the table and said, "We're here for you to sign your letter of resignation." And after a lot of posturing and argument, he said, "Well, it doesn't look like I got a way out." He signed it, and they all left. And he basically said, "Look what these guys have done to me." And he took it so badly. He did what he only knew best. He went up to Wales and got drunk, ceremonially drunk.
Sir John's downfall came after a series of questionable business decisions and a fallout with tractor baron Harry Ferguson. The following year, he and second wife Joan separated.
His drinking made her miserable, and we found a diary when we were children in a drawer, and we got an idea as children the difficulty that she was going through in coping with his alcoholism. And I suppose after his demise, it would have been very humbling for him to spend the last 10 years of his life reminiscing up in a converted farmhouse in North Wales about his life and where he went wrong, and maybe he figured out maybe he could have done things differently, I don't know.
"1959 was the year of the small car, from Ford's American-influenced Anglia to BMC's brand new British icon, the Mini. This was a rapidly expanding market, led by innovative design. Not to be outdone, that year Standard Triumph unveiled its new small car.
Quiet, please. Light.
Cue the Triumph Herald, a Coventry classic that has a very special place in my heart,
Hold it.
because it was my first car. And today I'm taking one round the track at Midland's engineering facility, Hariba Myra, where the first models were tested back in the 50s and 60s. My word, this brings me back. 17 years old, first car. Even the smell is right, Chris. Over the past 40 years, ex-AA man and Herald fanatic Chris Allen has owned 50 of them.
I think it's because they're so easy to fix, they're easy on the eye, very easy to drive, got an amazing turning circle of, it's 23 feet.
It likes these banks.
It doesn't matter, but if you knew how many of these doors that I've had fly open. In fact, I'm going to lock that in case you do it again.
I'd hate you to fall out on the banks.
I nearly lost my father-in-law on more than one occasion as we went round, and especially in convertibles.
And there are some nice touches to the design and the style of this car, aren't there?
It's got wings on the back, which is a throwback from the American cars in the late 50s, early 60s.
And those wings add something, don't they?
Yes, a touch of class.
A touch of class. That defines the Herald in my eyes. A touch of class.
In fact, the Herald owes its good looks to an Italian stylist, Giovanni Michelotti, who'd previously created cars for Ferrari and Maserati. At £702, it was more expensive than the Anglia and the Mini, but despite being prone to leaks and having the odd door fly open, well over 500,000 were sold. Standard Triumph was bought by Leyland in 1960, but Michelotti would go on to design more cars for them, including the TR4 in 1961. However, another car released that year would get all the attention. The Jaguar E-Type was based on the D-Type racing car that had won at Le Mans. And for a road car, it was fast. With its 3.8-litre engine, the E-Type was capable of speeds approaching 150 miles an hour. Test driver Norman Dewis, seen driving the car in this archive film, helped develop it.
Here we had now produced a car nobody else had got like it. And the applause it got was incredible. We never realised it would be so popular.
Costing just £2,000, the E-Type was half the price of an Aston Martin, and it was a great car to drive too.
The whole experience of driving an E-Type is a huge thrill because you sit quite low down and you've got this incredible bonnet that goes on forever in front of you. And, you know, as you put your foot down, the front rises up and you get this incredible roar. It's visceral, you feel part of the whole thing. Talk about putting Jaguar on the world map, but I mean that, you know, that was just another huge impact. And they just look great, don't they?
Today, the E-Type remains one of the most iconic designs to come out of Coventry. But while Jaguar reaped the rewards for its innovation, one of its old contemporaries was struggling to stay relevant. Under the British Motor Corporation, new Riley cars were simply rebadged versions of others in the BMC range. The Riley Elf was just an upmarket Mini, while the later Kestrel was a fancy Austin 1100. It would be the last Riley ever made. By the end of the decade, this once prestigious Coventry brand had been scrapped. Meanwhile, the Rootes brothers had moved into the small car market with the rear-engined Hillman Imp. The government insisted it was made at Linwood in Scotland, an area in need of regeneration. But as parts were shipped up from Coventry, production was inefficient, and the first models were unreliable and unpopular. To give the car a new image, the company looked to racing, and to a young driver they'd recently signed, Rosemary Smith.
Sorry, Miss Smith, I hope I haven't kept you waiting.
It's nice to be able to sit and do nothing for a while.
Why, have you been busy lately then?
Yes, actually, I've just come back from the south of France.
Rosemary was soon driving an Imp that had been souped up by Rootes engineers in Coventry, and she became so successful in it, they even made a film about her. But in truth, she always had something of a love-hate relationship with the car she was supposed to be promoting.
You know, the Imp It was a difficult enough little car to drive. I mean, when they saw this little tin box coming out originally, they thought, oh, you know, rubbish, utter rubbish. And basically it was.
I can't explain this.
But we had an empathy. It wanted to get to the end. I wanted to get to the end. I didn't want to give up. I didn't want it to break down. Okay, sometimes if it broke down, it broke down.
Our hearts are close to.
I mean, you had to manage it in a very sort of specific way, otherwise it could very well break on you. You had to be gentle with it, and it sort of appreciated it. I just found it just suited me.
Here's a simple idea for you.
They were very maneuverable, dancing along. You know, you could think of a person who walks really well and sort of has a spring in their step. Well, that was what the Imp was actually like. It was a lovely little car.
Rosemary won many top rallies in her Imp, but the car would never shake off its early reputation for unreliability. Coupled with inefficiencies and industrial action at Linwood, the Imp led to Root's downfall, and in 1967 the company was taken over by Chrysler. The takeover of Root signalled the beginning of the end for Coventry's motor manufacturers. In 1968, in an attempt to shore up Britain's car industry, British Leyland was formed, a giant conglomerate that included the now renamed Triumph, alongside Morris, Austin and Rover. But it gave little job security to Coventry's car workers, as most Leyland vehicles were made in Birmingham and Oxford, and the cars they turned out were some of the worst ever made in Britain. Leyland was bailed out by the government in 1975, but job losses led to the widespread industrial action that became synonymous with the British car industry. The knock-on effect in Coventry was disastrous. In 1980, over 60 years after it had first opened, production ended at the Triumph factory in Canley. By then, its workforce had fallen from a peak of 13,000 to just 2,000 workers. Jaguar also struggled under British Leyland, and although it launched iconic cars like the XJ6 and XJS, the opening of a new factory in Castle Bromwich was coupled with a decline in quality and reliability, which affected the brand's reputation. Having retired in 1972, there was little that founder Sir William Lyons could do.
I think he'd spent his whole life building that company up, and literally from the age of 21, it's pretty much all he thought about, and all his efforts were directed to that. To see it then slide out of control, yes, I think it was extremely difficult.
But Jaguar's fortunes were turned around by new boss Sir John Egan, who restored the company's image and oversaw its privatisation in 1984.
The cars are superb and endorsed by the way they're selling here at home and in major markets abroad.
While he could, Sir John took advice from Sir William Lyons, and the old boss had a hand in the design of Sir John's first hit, the XJ40. When Sir William died in 1985, the company he had founded over 60 years before was well and truly on the up.
Well, I hate to think, you know, if he'd gone to his grave having only witnessed his company in some kind of nosedive, I think that would have been incredibly sad. So, you know, it's important to us, to the family, that he saw a resurgence. And I'm glad that he lived to see that just before he died.
Sir William's old rival, Sir John Black, had died in 1965. Coventry Cathedral was packed with ex-Standard Triumph workers for his memorial service.
You know, as a son, I'm immensely proud of him. He really drove himself. He was focused on something over there, something beyond, and he was going to take the world with him. He was going to take everybody with him for the ride. And I think a lot of people in the end resented it, that he was too ambitious, he was too dictatorial. I think he's a forgotten hero in a sense. But who's heard of Captain Black? You know, who's heard of Sir John Black nowadays?
The past 120 years have been a roller coaster for Coventry's car industry. But just like its old classics, it's managed to keep going, despite the bumps. Today, it's reinventing itself again, and is now leading the way in future automotive technology. Designed in Coventry and assembled in Austria, Jaguar Land Rover's I-Pace is its first all-electric production car. Time will tell whether this will be the vehicle to propel the company through the challenges of another century. Meanwhile, there's been a resurgence in the traditional craft skills that made Coventry great. At Alvis, a new generation of craftsmen is hand-building their latest cars and restoring their old ones, using techniques passed down over the century.
For me, growing up in the Coventry area, there's always been that heritage of engineering. And I love the fact that it's sort of come...
Full circle.
Full circle, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
For Coventry, you know, it has come full circle. Yeah. Coventry's name is here because we're still hand-building, coach-built, bespoke, beautiful cars that we did back in the 1920s and 30s. So on a personal level, how much does it mean to you to be keeping this alive in Coventry?
We are custodians of what was a great motor heritage in Coventry, and I think it's our duty actually to preserve these sort of skills that were there, so that future generations can see exactly what was produced in this region.
It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
At the beginning of the 20th century, just a stone's throw from this spot on Coventry's canal basin, William Riley agreed to let his talented sons start making cars. Today, his grandson, Victor Riley, has set up an archive here, bringing the Riley name back to the city where it all began.
So, Victor, Riley has come home.
Yes, definitely.
So how important do you think this is, getting Riley back in the heart of Coventry, to the people of Coventry?
Very important, because we want to leave the people of Coventry, many of whom their fathers or grandfathers, uncles, aunts, worked at Riley. So the connection's strong, and we leave them a lasting legacy.
I am so pleased that Riley is back in Coventry. It is where it should be.
Yes, and it is our spiritual home, after all. The Riley history mirrors Coventry's history.